You. Good evening, everyone. Tim, alcoholic addict. A friend of mine says that the holiday season for alcoholics starts at Halloween and ends at the end of St. Patrick's Day. So we're coming to the end of a very long holiday season. Back to normal life tomorrow. So what we're going to be covering is chapter 9. And as with last week, I've selected certain passages. I've pulled things together so that if there are separate passages which are on the same topic, I've bundled them together to look at them, and hopefully we'll get through all of them this evening. If not, we'll tip over into next week. The first one is about our recovering alcoholic, and it says, perhaps they created the impression that he is to be wrapped in cotton wool and placed on a pedestal. Successful readjustment means the opposite. Now, one of the terrible things about coming to AA for a while and only after a while discovering the big book is you read the big book, you look at the AA you see, you read the big book, you look at the meeting, and you think these are two entirely different things. But what happens in meetings, and a lot of meetings, what we'll say is the newcomer is the most important person in the room, immediately placed on a pedestal, and wrapped in cotton wool. People often talk about newcomers as though they're infants or imbeciles, as though they don't know their arse from a hole in the ground, as Margaret Atwood memorably put it once. And that they're vulnerable and they need some special protection. I was dangerous when I was new. I was not vulnerable. I was the risk in the room. It wasn't. I did not need special treatment. I needed the special treatment to stop. I got a lot of special treatment out there because I had lots of problems, as they say. I had lots of behaviours. And in my early meetings, people weren't having it. I may have told this story in a previous week. If I have, I apologise, but hopefully it'll be a helpful one. I was at Pont Street, which was a big meeting, Monday evening, and I much liked the meeting in many ways, except the thing I didn't like was I wasn't the centre of attention. And so I thought, I know, I'm going to start scraping my chair around the floor. And then I worked myself up into something of a lather. And what I wanted to demonstrate was that I was having a nervous breakdown right there in the room. And everyone was ignoring me. And eventually I got to such a pitch, I thought I shall run out. People will follow me and ask if I'm okay. And I ran out and I waited outside and no one followed me. And about 2 minutes later, when I realised I was on my own, I had to go back into the meeting. I never scraped the legs of the chair against the floor in a meeting to create trouble ever again. That was over. Why? Because I wasn't treated differently. And I remember going to a sponsor and saying, oh, I'm going to a meeting where they have like special newcomers time to share. We're going to slow the meeting down for the newcomers because they have trouble finding their voice. Trouble finding their voice, my foot. If you've heard of step 5 and then you retroactively apply that and say, this is someone that's having trouble finding their voice. I remember a marvellous Glaswegian woman in London. There was a meeting where people were saying plaintively, I found my voice in recovery. And eventually you can see she was getting agitated. She said, I found my voice and I discovered it was a sledgehammer. You hear a step 5, sledgehammer all the way through. My sponsor said, why don't you share in the ordinary part of the meeting along with everyone else? Take your chances along with everyone else. And if you don't get in, hard luck. But don't treat yourself as a special type of alcoholic within AA. You're just on a level with everyone else. And I remember, I may have told this story as well. I told Maureen on a Saturday evening, I got her on the phone saying I was suicidal, and I said that I could express myself. we were talking about step 4. I could express myself effectively only, get this, through the medium of poetry. And she said a very bad word. And then she said, "You're a common or garden alcoholic." And thud, I came back down to earth. And that's what I've needed, is to be brought back down to earth. So I think treating newcomers with the dignity of being adults who can think for themselves, who are not going to run from the room because someone says the word God, who can tell that this is one person's opinion and not the whole of AA speaking to them. They'll know once they've heard 4 or 5 people there's a range of views in the room. I don't think newcomers need to be protected. If you don't know anything about London, Hackney is something of a, shall we say, a colourful area with lots of characters. It can be dodgy, it can be interesting. I love it, but it's not sedate. Someone said if they've survived the crack houses of Hackney, I'm sure they can survive an AA meeting, and I think that really covers it. Now, the next bit is brilliant. There are several passages which are all about how to get on in the family. And I'm just going to put them in the chat, or at least some of them. And I know that there are lots of terribly good books out there about how to have relationships, and there are television shows, and there are experts with PhDs that can tell us how to have good relationships, and some of them have TikTok accounts. Now, the big book, we must be very careful. If it gets out there, it's going to destroy the livelihoods of these people, because it has a very simple solution. All members of the family should meet upon the common ground of tolerance, understanding, and love. My understanding of a relationship and my understanding of a home with a family was that we didn't have common ground. You see, common ground implies each person has their own ground as well, and then there's common ground in between. So each person has their own private sphere, their own private domain, and then there's this common ground in the middle. In the house I grew up in, or failed to grow up in, there was no privacy, in the sense that, I mean, apart from the fact that people would literally break into locked cabinets to read people's diaries, I mean, there was literally no privacy. But there was the sense that you were not allowed to feel anything privately. The intrusion, the intrusive questioning, the wanting to get their tentacles all the way in to manipulate what was going on. Everyone tangled up inside other people's business. No one was responsible for what they felt, but everyone was responsible for what everyone else felt. So entangled, but no responsibility for themselves. It was extraordinary, but perfectly ordinary at the same time. This model is completely different. This model of, I have my own ground, my other half, Jonathan, he has his own ground, and we have common ground. This means I've never looked inside his phone, I've never looked on his computer, I've never looked at his web browser. I don't know who he's texting. And I don't care, and I'm not interested. It's his private life. If he wants to share something with me, he shares it, and if he doesn't, he doesn't, and that's the end of it. And he never pries into my life. If I want to volunteer something, it's received with gratitude, but there are never questions. Rabbi Manis Friedman says that in a marriage, if the wife says to the husband, "When you come in, please can you hang your coat up?" the right answer to that is yes. The wrong response to that is why? As if to say, I'll do it if I judge your inner reasons as being sufficiently valid. It's immediately an intrusion. So if Jonathan asks me to do something, it's done. I never ask why. and he's the same with me. And this is the common ground business. No intrusion into other people's minds unless they offer it. And that's why I feel safe with him. The common ground of 3 words: tolerance, understanding, and love. Tolerance means that I'm not to consider him to have any character defects. That's the nature of tolerance, is initially one sees them, but one has to stop seeing them after a while and treat anything which might be classified as a character defect as simply a landscaped feature of the person. Again, Rabbi Manis Friedman talks about, there's a book which is called something like Whatever Happened to Modesty, which is, if someone has character defects, you let them have them on their own. You don't pry, you don't observe, you don't monitor, you don't try to get in there to change them. However they are is perfect. However they are is how God made them. That's the end of it. Understanding. Notice that my job is to understand Jonathan, not to get him to understand me. So I don't need to propagandize myself. I don't need to get him to understand me. My job is to understand him. And love. Now, love is one of those dreadful words. People will say, oh, all you need is love, and love makes the world go round, and love is a many splendid thing, and love. There was a comedy series in the 70s in the UK where the theme song went something like this: love is like a butterfly. Now, there are so many definitions of love. I think Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, said that love is an absolute monstrosity. It is the ruiner of all small pleasures in life. Which love are you talking about? A monstrous parasite. That was what he said. Love is a monstrous parasite. So which love is being talked about here? Now, this is non-conference approved literature, but Thomas Aquinas said that love can be divided into 2 elements, or it can be understood as having 2 elements. The first one is benevolence, to wish someone well, and the second one is beneficence, to act in their benefit. So there's no sentiment in there. What I've discovered is that if I wish someone well and I act in their benefit, the sentiment will eventually come. I don't need to conjure it. The romance at the beginning is like the free pass that gets you in through the door. I can't tell you how many sponsees I've had. Men in marriages, 7 years in, say exactly the same thing. You can set your watch to it. The romance has gone out of the relationship. The love has gone out of the relationship. The excitement has gone out of the relationship. I'm like, if that's what you want, get an Xbox. You're barking up the wrong tree. When I set my objective within the home of being, as C.S. Lewis calls it, second servant, simply being a servant to make his life happy, then love flows automatically. But it's not the same love as the excitement in the first few weeks. I tell you which one is better. This one's better. It doesn't have that sickly feeling. It doesn't have that monstrous parasitic feeling. It's an entirely different creature. And that sort of love, you know it's spiritual because the more you practice it, the stronger it gets. And all of those sort of romantic, contemporary forms of love, or they're not contemporary forms of love, forms of love which are adulated in modern society, get weaker the more you practice them, which is why romance dies. Romance in the ordinary sense of romance dies. So this is the entire formula for how to have a relationship: tolerance, understanding, and love, which means I won't tell the whole story, but there was a situation about 20 years ago when I said to my other half something to the effect of, it wouldn't hurt if you did the dishes occasionally. With that polite understatement. You see how kindly I put it? And he went pale, left the room, came back 10 minutes later and said, "I have never ever criticised you. I could make a list as well." And that was the end of that. So we don't criticise each other. The most we can do is make a polite request. What makes a request polite is that its refusal doesn't offend or trigger rounds of manipulation and sighing and eye-rolling and persuasion. It's, "Oh, absolutely fine." That's the response to "no, I understand." And not to repeat the request for another year. That's the trick, not to bring it up the next day. As each member of a resentful family begins to see his shortcomings and admits them to the others, he lays a basis for helpful discussion. If Jonathan ever seems upset and I have an inkling that it might have been me, I go and I don't know what it is. I don't know what I've done, but I sense it. I'll go to him and say, "I'm a knucklehead. I know I've done something wrong here, but I can't see it. Can you please tell me what I need to stop doing, or what I need to start doing, or what I need to do differently?" And we've had a dozen of those conversations over the years, and every single time he's told me something I was doing I could not have come up with in 100 years of inventory. These family talks will be constructive if they can be carried on without heated argument, self-pity, self-justification, or resentful criticism. If either of us becomes so heated that we can't vouch for how we might behave, we've developed the habit of simply withdrawing until we're able to be entirely civil and entirely calm. And this has saved us perhaps thousands of pounds in lawyers' costs, because the things that are said can't be taken back. One has to be so careful. My favourite line in the book: "Each will have to yield here and there." And a friend of mine said, "You know that Sesame Street sketch where there are two characters and they're demonstrating to children that here and there are not absolute concepts but relative concepts. So one of them is here and the other one says, 'Come here,' and the first one says, 'No, I'm here, you're there.' And there's this whole conversation about here and there. And someone said to me once, everywhere is either here or there. So where it says each will have to yield here and there, you have to yield everywhere. Yield on everything. And we both yield on everything, and we find ourselves meeting in the middle. Neither of us put our foot down on anything unless there's something technical which is mission critical. And the next passage illustrates, I think, perfectly the nature of the problem and the nature of the solution. Is it not because each wants to play the lead? Is not each trying to arrange the family show to his liking? Is he not unconsciously trying to see what he can take from the family life rather than give? Again, it's got this idea of reality having two layers. There is the theatre, and then there is the play going on in the theatre. And of course, my job as an actor in a play is not to make up my lines or order the other people around, but simply to play my part. And the part is on page 85. Every day is a day when I must carry the vision of God's will into all my activities. And I don't see much of my family these days, mostly because most of the poor things are dead. But I see a few who are living in this country. Most are living abroad in France and Israel and Mauritius and other places. But I remember some very difficult family situations where I simply didn't know how to act. And I just locked straight into page 85. God, what is the vision of your will for me in this situation? Second servant, act right, keep your mouth shut, act right. And I do this at work. I had a situation with one of my employers and they were trying to rearrange a timetable for the following academic year. And all of the other lecturers were, well, I can't do this time, and this is very awkward. And with each of the questions, even though I didn't like the times that were being offered, I just said, fine by me, fine by me, fine by me. I want to be the person that is least problematic to the people around me. I no longer want to be the awkward person that's always wanting to have their own way. The next passage, the motto for this one is, the alcoholic's not the only sick one. Cessation of drinking is but the first step away from a highly strained, abnormal condition. A doctor said to us, years of living with an alcoholic is almost sure to make any wife or child neurotic. The entire family is to some extent ill. Now, the next thing I'm going to say is frightfully controversial, and one must be careful not to say it too loudly in Al-Anon because it can cause a problem. But in my family, I, of course, have 8 great-grandparents, and 5 were alcoholic. But none of my grandparents were alcoholic, and neither of my parents were alcoholic. But you can see Al-Anonism trickling down the family tree through the Al-Anons, and then in my generation and the generation below, alcoholics are popping out like buds in May everywhere. And it's almost as though the underlying condition is the Al-Anonism, and the alcoholics are drinking to get away from the Al-Anons. Just an idea, but my poor old alcoholic brother committed suicide on my mother's birthday. He was living away, and he wrote a letter essentially saying, "It's your presence in my life is so suffocating. I can't handle it. I can't ever see you again." And the letter came. I think it was, I don't know how it arrived. It came shortly before his death, and then there was the suicide, and then we got the telephone call. He didn't say he was going to commit suicide in the letter, but it became clear afterwards the two were connected. And I understand that. A friend of mine comes from a family where the 2 parents, Irish, transplanted to Kent, 5 children. The parents were not alcoholic, but were both Al-Anons, children of alcoholics. The 5 children, by the age of 30, had all emigrated to the west coast of Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. They could not get far enough away. That's not nothing. Those are 5 data points. And I understand that. The weight of living, of growing up with all of the expectations, to be the one in the family that wasn't the alcoholic, who would make amends for all of the alcoholics, who would succeed where all of the alcoholics fail, and then you become the alcoholic yourself. The whole thing is all mixed up together. I think one can perhaps acquire Al-Anonism, but boy, are the 2 sides of the problem fully interactive. The wonderful line from a friend of mine is this: the horns in the head of the alcoholic match the holes in the head of the Al-Anon. And after a while, he said, I'm not sure which side the horns are on. I think the horns and the holes are on both sides. It's not a case of persecutor and victim in the ordinary sense of the baddie and the goodie. And I've known people who are the sole alcoholic in a non-alcoholic family, and when they get sober and start to reassert their personality and start to say no to certain things legitimately, it sends the family into complete disarray, and it almost looks as though the family wants the person to get drunk again because they're easier to handle when they're drunk than when they're sober. They're somehow more cooperative when they're drunk, because when they're drunk, they're in the wrong. They make amends, and that card can no longer be played. So amends can be very dangerous to the family. The next line, I think, is wonderful. The family of an alcoholic longs for the return of happiness and security. They remember when father was romantic, thoughtful, and successful. Today's life is measured against that of other years, and when it falls short, the family may be unhappy. And the program is one, I believe, of a merciless living in the present, a decision to live in the present, absolutely come what may. And the danger is God cannot be found in either the past or the future. And in particular, fear is a great problem because it largely centres on the future. It can centre on the present and the past in certain circumstances. When there are uncertainties, one fears that something might have happened. People sometimes fear that something might have happened in their childhood that they have a repressed memory of. But generally, fear is about the future. And God can't help me with the future. I tried for years to think about the future in a spiritual way. And years into that, I was still frightened about the future. I now imagine that the future is not even an existing thing. There is simply me and God in the room together at the same time. And I'm saying to God, I'm worried about what's going to happen when I'm old. I'm worried about whether I will remain busy into my old age or if I'm just going to be sitting in a chair. I'm worried about where the money is going to come from. And God says to me, either you trust me or you don't. If you don't, I can't help you. Fear is my responsibility. It's not God's. God's responsibility is to be God and to say, trust me. My responsibility is to say yes. And this means coming out of the past, coming out of the future, and sticking in the day, even though all of the, as Dickens would have them, noisiest authorities tell me to think about the past, to think about the future. I was listening to something on French radio last summer about one of the old French colonies, which France left 200 years ago. And now, I'm not a historian. I'm not going to say the extent to which the problems of this country really are attributable to the French 200 years ago. But there's a very strong focus on the past, and I understand that. Me looking into my own distant past for where the problems are, if I can solve the problem there, it will come into the present and solve the problems in the present. Now, setting aside that particular French colony, my own condition is this. Even if things happened in my childhood which appear to be affecting me today because I learned when I was a child that blah, 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 that's not the problem. The problem is that I'm still holding that belief today. A friend of mine said, if you stepped in a dog mess on the street 30 years ago and your shoes still smelled, you're past the point at which you can blame the dog. The problem is that you haven't gotten rid of that. You've held on to it. You've kept it. You've stored it. You've nurtured it. You've built your whole identity around it. And I built my whole identity around the past, and in particular the family I grew up in. And this problem with the past, nostalgia is just as bad as dwelling on terrible memories of the past. The ego wants me in the past and the future because it doesn't want me to find God. That's why nostalgia is devilish. The next bit, I'd say this comes under the heading of the counsel of patience and positivity. And what it says is, I won't read the whole thing, it will take time to clear away the wreck. And it says the new structures will take years to complete. And my experience in early recovery was that there were an awful lot of low-hanging fruit in the first year. Learning how to organize my diet, learning how to get up at the same time every day, learning how to show up at a job. Immensely helpful. Lots of the other things, once the low-hanging fruit had gotten out of the way, frankly, it's taken a very long time. Temper took 30 years to really sort itself out. I have moments still, but it's nothing like it was even 5 years ago. Should it have been quicker? I don't know. The fact it wasn't. And that's the end of it. And I've stopped feeling guilty about how long it's taken to get over certain things. Got a problem with food, it might take a minute before it calms down. You might want to be patient with yourself about that one. And also, I think I talked about it last week, this gratitude business. They should be thankful he is sober and able to be of this world once more. On any given day, this is a Clancy line, on any given day, to be sober is entirely sufficient. And for me to be sober as an alcoholic, this is why meetings are so valuable. If I'm feeling really bad and really crazy and I can't sort myself out, to go to a meeting and develop some gratitude for the mere fact that I'm sober and I'm in the game. Nothing that is going on can possibly outrank that in terms of importance. If that is the frame for my life, I've been saved from death, and I'm in fact being re-saved from death every day. That's the notion of a daily reprieve. The notion of a reprieve is when someone has been given a death sentence and it is commuted or it is postponed or deferred. Every day the death sentence is deferred. If that is the frame, then each day is a gift. And whatever is going on in the frame is a frame of goodness. If I have a generally pessimistic and cynical view of the world, that is my frame. Anything which is going on inside it is a good thing inside a bad frame. There's a fundamental difference between a white sheet of paper with a few black blotches on it and a black sheet of paper with a few white blotches on it. And the difference doesn't lie in what percentage of the paper is covered in the blotches. The truth is what lies underneath. It's like with clouds and the fact that the sun is behind the clouds, you do not even need to be able to see the sun to know it is there. And it's like that with my sobriety. If I get the frame right, everything else is fine. Another great passage. If the family will appreciate that Dad's current behaviour is but a phase of his development, all will be well. In the midst of an understanding and sympathetic family, these vagaries of Dad's spiritual infancy will quickly disappear. Now, many years ago, I was in Paris and I was going to some AA meetings and I went to some French meetings and I went to some English meetings. Now, the English meetings at the time were divided into two different categories, and they were divided by which of the two Paris AA websites they were advertised on. There was aaparis.org and there was parisaa.org, and the people behind the two websites did not talk to each other. And so there was this terrific dispute, and no one could really remember what it was about, but everyone knew that there were two sides and there was a terrific problem, and the other side was dreadful, awful. And this old American said to me, he said, if you can stay sober in AA, you can stay sober anywhere. So yes, AA, CA, Al-Anon, they're wonderful fellowships, but boy, I mean, the way I learnt what I'm like as an Al-Anon was to go to Al-Anon meetings and just watch the behaviour, get my popcorn and watch the behaviour. And with all the behaviours I spotted, to say to myself, to force myself to say, I'm like that, but I can't see it. I'm like that, but I can't see it. And eventually you get this horrible sensation that the thing you just noticed is exactly what you like, what you're like. And that's how I realized my ability, for instance, to suck all of the oxygen out of a room, because I saw other people doing it and I could feel what it felt like. So I love Al-Anon because that's where I learn about myself. That's where I learn what I'm really like. But this point, the phase of the development, there is never any grounds for condemning other people or myself, because, as a friend of mine puts it, every single situation you find yourself in is a lesson which is part of God's curriculum, which is there to teach you something. And the opening gambit of the lesson, the first element of the lesson, is how you're messing up in a particular way. And then you have that revealed and you learn how not to mess up in that particular way. When you've learnt that, you can go on to the next lesson. So all of the behaviours one sees, which I don't think are any different in CA and AA than outside, but the volume is just turned up and it's intensified into it's like flavour and umami. Like, everything has flavour, but umami is real flavour. Behaviours are behaviours. In AA, boy, are they behaviours. And those behaviours can be mine as well. But the point is, whatever I'm seeing is always a phase that I either have been through or I'm going to go through. So there's no way I can judge in either direction. The person who's doing something is currently learning a lesson I've had to learn, or I will have to learn. And Anthony, my friend, says, everything you ever judge in AA, you'll end up doing. So be very careful about what you judge, and that's been my experience. So the next one, experience is the greatest asset. The Henry Ford comment, the alcoholic's past thus becomes the principal asset of the family, and frequently it is almost the only one. I remember in my first step 5, I said to Doug, I don't know where I'd heard this, I think I must have heard it in a meeting. I said to Doug, do I have any character assets? Because we talked about my character defects. I said, do I have any character assets? And I rubbed my little hands and thought, here it comes. I'm going to be told I'm special or I'm a miracle or something. He said, you do. And I said, oh, tell me. And he said, a willingness to change. That was the only asset cited. Now, I don't know if I overstate or understate how unwell I was when I got to AA, but I was regularly being referred to clinics. I didn't go, but I was referred because I'm elusive. I was very unwell. But every single thing that I've gone through, every single awful thing that I've generated within myself makes me useful with other people. And I don't regret a thing. I don't regret the suicidal behaviour. I don't regret when I was living in Finland in 1990. We lived near a fairly major road which ran along the south coast of Finland. And I would, during the night, in the summer, in Finland, it stays light, very late, right through into the early hours. And I used to go and sit on the centre line in the middle of the road, hoping that a car would hit me so that I would die and it wouldn't be my fault and it would be considered an accident of some description. Because my brother had committed suicide, and so he'd used up the family suicide voucher. I think each nuclear unit has a family suicide voucher once one person has committed suicide and the effect on all of the others is visible. The notion that a second person could do it's beyond the pale, it's unconscionable. And I wanted to die, and car after car would skirt round me and I was never hit. I'm glad that has happened, because that's been useful in a number of conversations I've had over the years to pierce through the metre thick wall of concrete separating another person from me, people who'd done similar things. And the next passage, showing others who suffer how we were given help is the very thing which makes life seem so worthwhile to us now. Cling to the thought that in God's hands the dark past is the greatest possession you have, the key to life and happiness for others. With it you can avert death and misery for them. I remember about 15 years ago, maybe less, I was on the National Subcommittee for Armed Services Liaison, and so I was in charge of various aspects of carrying the AA message to the armed services in the UK, in Great Britain rather, and the veterans, the various veterans organisations, and a lot of this was to do with the National Health Service and other agencies. And I remember I did a presentation, and it was to around 100, 150 health and mental health professionals who were patient-facing, so were dealing with service personnel, the families of service personnel, and in particular veterans. And there are around 5 million veterans in Great Britain, or there were at the time. I think it's less now. And after the event, the PowerPoint presentation and some other notes and pamphlets and all sorts of things about AA and the ways in which AA was cooperating around the country with the armed services went out by email, and they didn't BCC it. And I took the list and I did a little electronic thing and worked out that had gone to 1,800 health professionals in the NHS and in the Army and in the Navy and in the Air Force and in all sorts of other agencies. And I thought each of those people is going to come across alcoholics for the rest of their life. If this was the only thing I have done this year, it makes everything else worth it. If I was just sitting like a tapioca pudding for the rest of the year, I would still be ahead on points just for that one thing. Not because I was doing anything special, but I happened to be the dinner lady serving this particular dinner. And that made my life, I was good for a year then. Of course, other things happened that year. I did do other things that year. And I feel the same if I go to my AA group each week. I do the morning meditation. I speak to sponsees for 2 hours a day, sometimes more, 3 or 4 hours some days. Everything else is gravy on top. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters really. I do it like it matters. I do my job like it's the most important thing in the world, but without it mattering. That's the great trick. The next principle, and I'm going to hopefully speed up a little bit at this point, obligations towards others. We think each family which has been relieved owes something to those who have not. Giving rather than getting will become the guiding principle. And this is my solution for any awkward situation, particularly social situations. What can I bring to this? Not how can I talk about anything which is interesting, but I'll give you the example because it's something that's not talked about very much, but I think it's very important. Don Pritz would say that the meeting was the formality. The real business was what happened afterwards at breakfast after the meeting or dinner after the meeting. His home group for many years was in Denver, somewhere in the greater Denver area, but it was called an AA group on the basis of Tradition 3. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together may call themselves an AA group. So they called themselves an AA group, and they used to go for breakfast afterwards. He said that's where the real business happens. And so when I go for fellowship after Brick Lane on a Saturday, fellowship is the real business. And I'm not there to have dinner. I have dinner. I actually quite like my dinner there. The food's very good. Cheap, very good. But the real thing is to make sure that everyone around me at the table is being included. If they're being dealt with by other people, I'm off the hook. But I'm always on the lookout for people who are being excluded. Just because of the way the conversations are dividing up. And my job is to help bring those people into the conversation. If everyone is doing that, the whole thing is an absolute party. The whole thing is a torchlit procession. It's brilliant. There is a story which crops up in different cultures in various forms. And it's one of a parallel set of images of heaven and hell. And in both, the scenario is exactly the same. And it is this: these people are at a banquet and they've got lots of food in front of them. But they've got these spoons which are incredibly long. And the spoons are so long, they can't actually get the food into their own mouths. And hell, people are trying to get food into their own mouths and failing. Heaven, people are simply feeding each other. And so the difference between a hellish situation and a heavenly situation lies only in whether I'm considering myself or whether I'm considering the other people in my company at the table. Another passage. And if you start sending questions through, once the questions start coming, then we'll move to questions and we'll do the rest of this chapter next time, so we're not going to get through all of it now. Once amends are made, drop the past is my little motto. Now, the passage I wanted to talk about was this. So we think that unless some good and useful purpose is to be served, past occurrences should not be discussed. Now, this comes up in lots of different situations. I learnt this principle from someone I know in AA who hears confessions. And he says, when you hear a confession, never bring up in your response the thing they said at the last confession. Treat each confession as an entirely fresh experience. And Anthony de Mello talks about the principle that when you're asleep, when someone walks in the room, you don't see them. You see all of your memories of that person. And then you're reacting not to who they are today, not to what they're doing today, not to what they're saying. You're reacting to all of your past memories. You're only ever seeing the past unless you wake up to what is actually there right now. And to me, all of this points yet again to the notion I must be in the present. Now, when I have an emotional reaction to something which is off key, the three terms are these: if it's untimely or disproportionate or inappropriate, there's something fishy about it. In the investigation of what's going on, the answer is always this: I'm not reacting to the situation. The situation has reminded me of something else, and I'm reacting to the something else. There's a line in the A Course in Miracles where it says, you're never upset for the reason you think. And it's terribly important, especially with sponsees as well, when they're reacting to you as a sponsor. They're not reacting to you. They're reacting to their parents. They're reacting to a teacher. They're reacting to a boss from 1987. It's not about me. If someone is reacting to me, it's not about me. If I'm reacting to someone else, it's not about them. And one has to go into the past, deal with it, and put it away. The next passage. So the questions I've added: do we talk about each other? What is gossip? The line in the book is a surprising one. We do talk about each other a great deal, but we almost invariably temper such talk by a spirit of love and tolerance. There is a rather Orwellian notion, if I dare say so, in AA, and I think it's in the other 12-step fellowships as well. I'm not sure whether there's the so-called yellow card in other fellowships, but in AA we have this yellow card with this rather sort of ominous finger pointing. You can tell it was written by untreated Al-Anon. I mean, the fact it has a pointy finger, I mean, for heaven's sake, how did that get through the editorial stage? Pointy finger saying, "Who you see here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." So someone had a little resentment there, didn't they? Someone had a little resentment and they turned it into a question for conference. They were so proud when conference passed the yellow card. Now, some secretaries of meetings, that's not good enough for them. That's not chiding enough. They say, "Gossip kills." They literally say that in meetings. Now, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with this one. Of course, it's absolutely right. One shouldn't gossip about people. One shouldn't be cruel or unkind, or carry tales, or pass on secrets, or run to people's employer and say, "Did you know Sally's in AA?" Of course, one doesn't do any of that. What the book is counselling is a sensible middle ground. We do talk about each other a great deal, but we almost invariably, you see, there's an admission of the occasional failure there, isn't there? We almost invariably temper such talk by a spirit of love and tolerance. But on that thing, there's a bit where it says, "The thought of drink has never returned, except when it has, then he hasn't drunk anyway." It never returns except when it returns. So there are a few of those little things where it draws back from making an absolute statement. So the question is not whether we talk about each other. Of course we do. The question is how, and the question is why. And I'm not a sociologist. I'm not anything. I'm good at punctuation. That's one of my specialist subjects. I'm amateur with everything else. But I'm given to understand by sociologists who I've talked to and known that it's really important for kids to be with other kids, to learn how to socialise with other kids and be exposed to lots of behaviours and learn how to deal with them. And AA has been the most wonderful school for learning how to deal with every imaginable personality type. And if someone becomes too much, you literally just go to a different meeting. You never need to see the person again. If a sponsorship relationship breaks down, as Clancy says, you just say F you to your sponsor, and that's the end of it. There is no sanction. There's no response the sponsor can give to get his own back, which means it's safe to get things wrong. Now, when things happen, of course, one is reacting constantly to what is going on, especially if you're sponsoring. You're dealing with people's demons, that all of the darkest stuff comes up, which doesn't come out in the person's ordinary everyday interactions or in meetings. You're dealing with it's a lot. It really is. Now, can you imagine what a monstrous, this is why I said it was Orwellian, what a monstrous injunction it would be to say all of those reactions you ever have to another human being in AA, never mention them to anyone. You got to deal with all of that stuff in your room on your own, just you and God. Keep your mouth shut. It's grotesque, and also it doesn't work. The way I've learnt about what is really going on, how to deal with people and how to deal with my reactions, is doing a debrief afterwards, reverse engineering what happened there. You know those situations where you know something happened, but you're like, what the hell? That was a roller coaster, and I do not understand any of my reactions. I don't understand what they did. You have to take that to your close friend or your sponsor and say, can we work out what happened? You don't have to mention the name. This is about processing this stuff. As I say, there are so many ways in which one must be careful. I listed them earlier about not carrying tales, not doing it maliciously, not stirring, not trying to turn people against each other, not triangulating. Of course, one mustn't do those things. And it must always be in the sense of, as a friend of mine says, clinical hats all round. We're simply trying to understand what happened. We're not here to judge other people. And this will be the last point before we go on to some questions, so get them rolling in. I may have mentioned this before. There's a Buffy episode where someone is sired into becoming a vampire and is about to rise for the first time. And Buffy, the vampire slayer, is waiting by the grave, and he pops out and she says, Mike! And he says, Buffy! And it turns out they're in college together, they're in Psych 101 together, and they have this conversation, this sort of badinage, as the French would say, going back and forth. And this is interrupted by them fighting to try to kill each other. She's trying to kill him, he's trying to kill her. But they keep stopping and they keep using their Psych 101 half-baked knowledge against each other, as though that psychological discussion is part of the battle, is part of the weaponry. And he says at one point, don't worry, I'm not here to judge you, I'm just here to kill you. And it's brilliant. So the reason I have to discuss things is because I will explode if I don't. And it is not to judge the person in response to whom I've had some kind of violent emotional reaction. I just want to understand what happened. And I think we need some sanity around this, because I've seen this again and again and again and again and again. In inventory, someone says, I gossiped about so-and-so, and it wasn't gossip. Now, of course, sometimes it was gossip, but often it wasn't gossip. They were simply talking to a friend because they needed to talk to someone. If one doesn't know how to make the distinction between gossip and talking, it's dangerous. If you can make the distinction, it becomes safe. So now I'm just going to close the door because my other half is back. Just a moment. I think he knows I talk about him. Anyway, on to the questions. This is terribly good. Question: have you ever recommended treatment or detox to someone new, or always just advise meetings and the steps? You really do not want someone to have some kind of seizure in the meeting, especially if you said you don't need detox, just have a biscuit and a cup of tea and listen to Sally talking about step 7. That's not going to stop the seizure from happening. I think these days the question is considerably complicated by the fact that today you get some pure alcoholics, and they will divide pretty neatly into the people that are constantly under the influence of alcohol and the people who are basically daily binge drinkers. I wasn't constant. I was a daily binge drinker, and I think, constantly under the influence to a certain extent, but I wasn't topping up all through the day. I would not drink through the night. I would not drink through the day, hit 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock the next day, off running again. In that condition, it wasn't dangerous for me to just come off completely. If there's any danger of it, you absolutely make sure they contact their GP and get referred through their general practitioner to an appropriate service. Often the GP can offer a so-called home detox. I'm not sure what the current protocol is, what the current gold standard is, and it may vary from local authority to local authority, and it certainly will vary from country to country. That's terribly important. The second category of person is rather different. It's where there's a whole cocktail of stuff going on, particularly if it involves marijuana won't make a huge amount of difference, but if someone is on benzos, if someone is on opiates or opioids, you've got to be incredibly careful. And my experience of friends who have had to come off a combination of alcohol and amphetamines and benzos, which is the kind of holy trinity, you have the uppers in the left pocket and the downers in the right pocket, and you just kind of calibrate something in between. What they report is it took about 3 months for everything to be so entirely out of the system that the physical craving element of it was gone. It took 3 months for the cravings to die down. You probably better be locked away somewhere for that. I have seen people do people on lower doses of benzos. Of course, the benzo detox is incredibly difficult, because if they've been buying them from Macedonia and it's all completely illicit, you don't know what the strength of those. I don't have it in for Macedonia. I've got a friend who literally got them from Macedonia, so any Macedonians listening, don't take offence. But you literally don't know what the doses are, because often it's cut with other things. It's they're not, they're bootlegged. And so the detoxes are difficult. I've seen people do them over 2 or 3 weeks if they're on lower doses of benzos. But frankly, with the benzo detoxes, I see a lot of people just failing, and a residential detox and residential treatment seems to be necessary with it, but it depends very much on what combination is being taken. But you never take medical matters into your own hands. In the big book and in the early AA literature, Dr. Bob Comes of Age, I think, has stuff about this, how they would home detox people with alcohol. Unless you know what you're doing there, don't even think about that, because you don't want a dead body on your hands, and that literally can happen. So to make sure people are put firmly in the hands of medical professionals, and that we get to take over once they're physically clean and detox, just like it says in the doctor's opinion. And I can't help people who are drunk. I can help them get into detox. That is it. Next question. When you go for fellowship after the meeting where the real business is handled, do you just try to include people in a general conversation? Do you inquire about how their recovery is going, what step they're on, or other things to try to help them along their way in recovery? People sniff a do-gooder a mile off, and when they sniff one, the shutter comes down. What the book says is brilliant on this in chapter 7. Basically, let him take the conversation wherever he wants to go with it. And if they want to talk about recovery stuff, let them bring it up. But I just want to get to know the human being in front of me. And then if the whole person is brought in, so they're not just there as like the person who is trying to recover, with everyone else at the table cast almost like the helping professionals, because you see that happening at fellowship sometimes, and it's just replaying a kind of social services role. To give the person the chance to be an entire human being, and therefore on a level with everyone else in the room. Because the trouble is, with recovery, I know there isn't a hierarchy in terms of the person who is sober or clean or in Al-Anon for 30 years is not higher up than anyone else. If anything, they're lower down doing the supporting. But what they are is further ahead. And that's not nothing. It's not everything, but it's not nothing either. But there is a perception of hierarchy. If all of the discourse is about recovery and there's never anything about anything else, the newcomer is always on the lowest rung of the ladder, they think. We might not think that there's a ladder, we might think it's all really egalitarian, but the newcomer will not necessarily know that. I felt that very keenly when I was new, that when the discussion was only about recovery things, I felt often locked out because I didn't understand a damn thing. But when people asked about what I was doing during the day, what my job was like, where I lived, where I'd come from, I felt I had something to bring to the table. So I think you let people bring things up as they see fit. If someone's in trouble and clearly sometimes people are asking for help without using words, and they're doing there are behaviors which indicate that they would, and you ask them and they're so relieved that they've been asked finally what's wrong. But you've really got to play it by ear, but really to be led by what the other person wants to talk about. Any experience suggestions in keeping in touch and how to speak with fellows when in really large fellowships? Is the goal to be on good terms with all, but not necessarily have feelings of obligations to call everyone? It's a really interesting question. I never ever want to have a conversation with another human being for the rest of my life who is speaking to me because they feel obliged. One of the problems in my family has been the sense of duty, and people always know when you're seeing them, when you're going to visit them, or you're calling them out of a sense of duty, and it's patronizing. And it's really, in the long term, it's water torture. So I call people in recovery who I want to call and who I enjoy speaking to. If I don't want to call, I don't call. I'll return a call to transact some business. But you've got a couple of different things going on there. You've got calling because there's some kind of instinctive desire to interact with someone, and you've got calling to transact business. Often I've called people to transact business in AA to get some advice, to get some input, but that's a different thing. There, one doesn't even necessarily like the person, but you really need their help and they're really happy to give it. And that's a valid type of transaction. And you enjoy the experience, but you wouldn't want to go for dinner with them. But I think it's really important, and I try terribly hard not to have enemies in the fellowship, because you don't know who you're going to need, and you don't know who's going to be there in 10 years' time. You think at various points, well, if you're like me, you're going to think that all your best friends, you're going to go off into the sunset forever. Everyone's going to stay sober and it's going to be great. You're going to be in a retirement home together in 30 years' time. Maybe, but don't count on it. And I've lost some people I was very, very close to, 4 in particular over the years. And you don't get past that quickly. And one of the most shameful things I've felt is sometimes in a meeting thinking, why did God take my friend and not that person? Absolutely wicked. Because that person then turns out to become a good friend, to become a valuable person in my life. The writing off of anyone, I must never ever do it. And so one can't be chummy with everyone, but what I seek to do is to eliminate any coldness, any hostility. And I've had situations where there are people I absolutely had no time for and for whom the feeling was mutual. But over the years, we're never going to go on holiday together, put it that way. But when we sit next to each other at fellowship, we have a really good time. And I discover that there's one chap in particular where we had some real run-ins, But we've got a mutual friend who's in real trouble, and we've talked about him, and I feel very warm towards this chap now because of how much he looked after our mutual friend. And he had a goodness and a loyalty towards that mutual friend that no one else had. And so shame on me for ever thinking that anyone in the room is not of incalculable value. So, but I don't have to force it. The Al-Anon introduction says we don't force solutions. And a friend of mine said, systems and procedures are there to cover up for incompetence. When you get good at something, you don't have any systems or procedures anymore. It's like you climb a ladder to a higher level, then you kick the ladder away. And I think it's like that sometimes with the questions one asks in recovery. One's trying to establish a system, one's trying to establish a procedure. And if you do that, I create a monster in myself by trying to live that way. Unfortunately, I think one's got to learn. One can listen to things and learn a little bit, but one's got to try things and find out what works and what doesn't work, not try to build systems and then live inside them like a sort of mechanical clockwork creature. One more thing and then we'll stop. So regarding gossip, what would it mean if the 12 traditions are adopted in all facets of recovery? I saw this question earlier and then I postponed it because I don't fully understand how it relates to the gossip question. But the steps provide a basic method for me to have a spiritual awakening. That's the first part. The traditions and the concepts provide the basis for living in terms of the actual methods and algorithms and principles and ideas to actually put the bare bones of 10, 11 and 12 into practice in my life. And so on this gossip or other people business, I'll just run through how the traditions apply to that. Tradition 1. Group unity is immensely important, so never to do anything which creates factions or groups, to hold the hand out to people that are not in one's own little clique, to treat everyone as important and not just... This is why fellowship, everyone together, is so important. A few years ago at Brick Lane, some people said they didn't like the restaurant, the food wasn't good enough and there was too much gluten in it or something. So they went off in a special little clique to a fancy place that most of the people in the room couldn't afford. And it creates division. So we're all in it together. And if you know you're in it together, it stops you from being mean, because you know you're going to be sitting next to them on Saturday and you can't do it. That's why the fellowship is so important. Which other traditions apply? Tradition 3, no conformity. No one has to be like me to be okay. People are allowed to be very different, believe utterly different things, and be welcomed by me the same as I welcome my friends. Tradition 4, if other people are doing things differently, you leave them be. It's not my business. Tradition 5, to help people get sober. And that's it. All of the other things are irrelevant. Tradition 10, what other people are doing, what they believe, what they think, none of my business. And in particular, I think the anonymity in tradition 12 is important here. As I said earlier, when talking about difficult situations, I'm not talking about the person. I'm talking about the facts of the situation, my reaction to it, and the principles involved. So when I've got a resentment against someone and I'm, let's say, processing it with someone else, I'm not talking about them. The inventory isn't on Sally. The inventory is on why I'm a jerk for resenting the person. And if one does that in the right tone with the right respect, it stops being gossip, and one can do inventory on one's reaction to a person without denigrating them at all, with a full degree of respect. So I think it's a good question. Keith, I think I'm done. I think that's it. We'll carry on with chapter 9 next week.